The room smelled of burnt metal and ozone, the usual stench of war councils where decisions were made that would cost lives. Commander Avery stood at the head of the table, his grizzled face half lit by the holographic display of a planet in ruin. 100 seasoned warriors sat before him, each more dangerous than the next. They had been chosen because they were the best. The fact that none of them looked particularly impressed told Avery just how much they'd seen. He cleared his throat. The Butcher of Worlds. His voice carried the weight of legend. You've all heard the name. The room remained silent. Of course they had. The name alone sent shivers through the galaxy. A warlord who didn't conquer but erased. Cities weren't occupied under his reign. They were wiped from existence. Entire civilizations turned to nothing but smoldering craters. No one knew what he truly was, human, machine, god, or demon. All they knew was that he couldn't be stopped. Avery tapped the console, and a grainy recording flickered into life. At first, it was just a ruined cityscape. Then, black fire erupted across the skyline, moving unnaturally fast, swallowing buildings in seconds. The screams cut off as the flames touched flesh, leaving only eerie silence. When the fire faded, nothing remained, not bones, not rubble, not even dust. That was yesterday, Avery said grimly. The planet's gone. A scoff came from the back. A tall, scarred man leaned forward. Carter, a bounty hunter whose reputation was almost as brutal as the butcher's. If 100 of us are going, I'm guessing there's a catch. Avery nodded. We have one shot at this. The butcher has gone to ground on an uncharted world. We hit him before he moves again. He let that sink in before adding. The payout is enough to buy a moon. And you'll all receive full pardons. Now he had their attention. Sloane, a heavily armored mercenary, cracked his knuckles. What's the play? Avery exhaled slowly. We go in fast, heavy, and together. Don't underestimate him. You're the best, but so were the last 50 who tried. The silence that followed was heavy. Then someone laughed, and just like that, the tension cracked. After all, they were hunters, killers, warriors. The idea of a fair fight thrilled them. On board the warship, the assembled force was a mixture of elite soldiers, bounty hunters, assassins, and exiled warlords. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The ship's mess hall became a gambling den within minutes, bets being placed on who'd survive, who'd die first, and who'd be the one to take the butcher down. Carter sat at the far end, cleaning his rifle with slow, practiced strokes. Sloane plopped down across from him, setting a mug of something questionably legal on the table. Hope you've got a will written up. Carter smirked. I don't plan on dying. Sloane raised a brow. That makes one of us. Nearby, Alice, a sniper with a reputation for never missing, adjusted the scope of her rifle. Anyone else wondering why a guy who's supposedly immortal hasn't just taken over the whole galaxy? The table went quiet. It was a fair question. If the butcher was truly unstoppable, why hadn't he crushed everything in his path? Before anyone could speculate, the AI voice of Vera crackled to life. Entering planetary orbit. Commencing descent. Carter stood, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Guess we're about to find out. The dropships shuddered as they broke through the planet's atmosphere. The surface below was a wasteland, blackened and scarred as if it had been burned 1,000 times over. Jagged, unnatural structures rose in the distance, neither fully metallic nor organic. They pulsed faintly, as if alive. As the ships touched down, the hunters stepped onto ashen ground. The air was thick, heavy with something they couldn't name. There was no wind, no movement, no sound beyond their own boots crunching against the dead earth. This place gives me the creeps, Alice muttered. Stay sharp, Carter warned. We're not alone. Then the comms cut out. One by one, every hunter's earpiece fizzled with static. Sloane tapped his helmet, frowning. Jamming tech? More like something doesn't want us talking, Carter said. That was when they heard it. A laugh. Low, guttural, inhuman. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. Weapons were raised, eyes scanning the darkened landscape. But there was nothing. Yet. And then, the first hunter vanished. One moment, he was standing there. The next, he was gone. No scream, no struggle. Just empty space where he'd been. Move! Carter barked. Too late. The ground itself seemed to shift, shadows stretching unnaturally. Figures emerged, shapeless, shifting things that flickered between reality and nightmare. Bullets passed through some like mist, while others moved with terrifying speed, tearing through armor and flesh alike. Avery's plan had been simple: hit fast, hit hard. But no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Especially when the enemy is waiting for you. The first death had been silent. The second wasn't. A scream tore through the calm static as one of the hunters, a soldier named Dax, was yanked backward into the dark. His rifle clattered to the ground, his body vanishing into a stretch of shifting shadows. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. "Eyes up!" Carter barked, spinning toward the movement. His rifle spat fire, the muzzle flashed briefly, illuminating figures in the gloom. They weren't human. They weren't even close. The creatures were hunched, flickering between states of being, 1 second solid, the next an inky mist. Their limbs stretched unnaturally long, claws glinting like obsidian. Eyes like burning coals watched from the darkness. And then they moved. Gunfire erupted as the hunters opened fire. Some of the creatures exploded into mist upon impact, but others, too many, kept coming. A beast lunged at Alice, but she sidestepped, her pistol pressed under its chin as she pulled the trigger. The thing's head burst apart, yet its body remained standing, twisting in a way that defied logic before collapsing into the dirt. "They're not dying right!" she shouted. "Fall back!" Carter ordered, but retreat was proving impossible. The ground beneath them was shifting. No, not the ground. The shadows. They stretched, slithered, grabbed. A hunter named Pierce swung his flamethrower in a wide arc, setting several of the creatures ablaze. Their screams were inhuman, warping in and out of the audible range. Some fell, but others charged through the fire, completely unfazed. Sloane swung his axe through the nearest enemy, severing it at the waist. For a moment it hung there, frozen in place, before its upper half twisted unnaturally and reattached itself. "That's not fair," he grunted before driving a grenade down its throat and kicking it backward. The explosion sent black ichor splattering across the ashen ground. Still, the enemy kept coming. Carter knew this wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. "Inside! Now!" He pointed toward the nearest structure, a crumbling fortress barely visible through the thickening darkness. The survivors ran, covering each other as best they could. Alice dropped to one knee mid-sprint, taking down 2 more creatures with pinpoint shots before following. The moment they crossed the threshold, something changed. The creatures stopped at the entrance, lingering at the edge as if held back by an unseen force. The remaining hunters, barely half of them now, stood panting, weapons still raised. No one spoke for several seconds. Sloane wiped black ichor from his face. "Well, that sucked." Carter ignored him, staring out at the shifting figures beyond the entrance. "Why aren't they following?" Alice reloaded her rifle. "More importantly, what the hell are they?" Nobody had an answer. The fortress smelled of old death and something worse. The walls were a fusion of metal and what looked disturbingly like flesh, pulsing faintly as if alive. Their footsteps echoed as they moved cautiously deeper, weapons raised. "No way this place was built by humans," Pierce muttered, running a gloved hand over the organic metal. Alice frowned. "Maybe it wasn't built at all. Maybe it just grew." That didn't sit right with anyone. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with something Carter could only describe as wrong. Then the whispers started. Soft at first. Just faint murmurs, like distant voices caught on the wind. But there was no wind here. One of the hunters, a man named Vale, stumbled. "Did you hear?" A shadow erupted from the floor, swallowing him whole. His scream was brief. The darkness spat his rifle back out a second later. "Keep moving," Carter ordered through clenched teeth. The hallways twisted unnaturally, forcing them deeper. Soon, they came to a vast chamber, where something hung in the center of the room. No, someone. The body was suspended in the air, impaled on jagged black tendrils that pulsed like veins. His armor was tattered, his helmet missing. But his face. Avery? Sloane breathed. The commander had been here before them. And he was still alive, barely. His eyes flickered open, unfocused. His lips moved, forming soundless words. Alice stepped forward cautiously. Sir? Avery's body jerked violently. The black tendrils convulsed, twisting deeper into his flesh. His mouth opened, and a voice that was not his own spoke. You have already lost. The hunters stepped back, weapons raised, but it was already too late. The chamber shifted, the walls pulsing as if waking from a deep slumber. The fortress wasn't a refuge. It was a cage. The butcher had been waiting for them. A deep rumbling filled the space. The tendrils keeping Avery suspended retracted, slamming his lifeless body to the ground. But the voice, low, guttural, ancient, continued to speak from everywhere at once. You came seeking a legend. The shadows at the far end of the chamber peeled apart, revealing a towering figure. Now you stand before it. The Butcher of Worlds stepped into the dim light. His armor was unlike anything they had seen, part metal, part shifting void, swallowing light itself. His face, what little of it was visible, was pale and scarred, with eyes that burned like dying stars. He carried no weapon, yet the air around him hummed with power. For the first time, Carter felt something he hadn't in years. Fear. The butcher tilted his head slightly, as if amused by their defiance. Run! It was not a suggestion. It was a command. The walls rippled. The whispers grew into a chorus of screaming voices. The fortress was collapsing, twisting in on itself. The remaining hunters turned and ran. But not all of them made it. The corridors twisted as they ran, the walls shifting like living things. The fortress no longer followed the rules of reality. It was warping, shifting around them, trapping them in a maze that had no exit. Alice cursed under her breath as the path they'd just taken closed behind them, the walls sealing together, as if they had never existed. It's playing with us, she muttered. Carter kept moving. Then we don't play. The whispers were no longer distant. They surrounded them, pressing in, voices that were too many and too familiar. Carter swore he could hear the voices of men and women he had fought beside, men and women who had died screaming. Then one of the voices whispered his name. He froze. It wasn't just some twisted trick. It was her voice. Sarah. The others hadn't noticed he'd stopped, still pressing forward in their desperate bid for an escape. But Carter stood rooted in place as the walls ahead of him flickered, and suddenly, he was somewhere else entirely. The battlefield was different, but he knew it instantly. The air was thick with smoke, and the smell of burning flesh was overwhelming. He turned, seeing the moment play out exactly as it had before, the day he left her behind. Sarah lay on the ground, reaching for him, blood soaking her uniform. Carter! She whispered again, just like she had then. Just like before, he reached for her, but something gripped his wrist, yanking him backward. Alice. She slapped him across the face. It's not real, Carter! Move! He blinked, the illusion gone. The battlefield melted away, and he was back in the shifting fortress, the butcher's voice echoing through the halls in a low chuckle. Alice yanked him forward. Don't listen. Don't stop. He ran, forcing himself not to look back. The remaining hunters stumbled into a vast chamber, the walls lined with jagged, alien architecture. The ground pulsed beneath them, glowing faintly like cooling embers. And at the center, waiting for them, was the butcher. He stood motionless, the flickering light casting jagged shadows across his form. His armor wasn't metal, not entirely. It pulsed with darkness, shifting as if alive. His face, what little of it was visible beneath his hooded helm, was lined with deep scars, his pale skin stretched over sharp bone. But it was his eyes that made them stop cold. They weren't human. They weren't anything close. You were never meant to leave, the butcher said, his voice carrying the weight of something ancient. You were sent to die. Sloane tightened his grip on his axe. Yeah? We'll see about that. The butcher exhaled softly. You don't even understand what you are. And then he moved. He didn't charge. He didn't attack in some brutish, straightforward way. He appeared among them, too fast to follow, his hand wrapping around Sloane's throat. The massive hunter was lifted off the ground effortlessly, his body twitching as the butcher's fingers tightened. Sloane gasped, swinging his axe wildly, but the blade passed through the butcher's form like smoke. You came here thinking I was a man, the butcher said, almost amused. That was your first mistake. Then he squeezed. Sloane's body convulsed as black tendrils erupted from his chest, burrowing into his flesh. His eyes rolled back, and then, he was gone. Not just dead. Gone. His body dissolved into the darkness, absorbed into the butcher's shifting form. That, the butcher said, turning toward the remaining hunters, is your fate. Alice fired first, her sniper round piercing straight through the butcher's forehead. Nothing happened. The butcher tilted his head slightly, as if the bullet had been a mild inconvenience. Predictable. Then he raised his hand. The entire chamber shuddered as the shadows twisted, forming jagged, spiked limbs that lashed out. Pierce was impaled instantly, his body yanked into the air before vanishing into the writhing blackness. The others scattered, firing wildly, but their weapons did nothing. Carter ducked behind a collapsed structure, his mind racing. This wasn't just a fight. This wasn't something that could be won with bullets and brute force. The butcher wasn't an enemy in the traditional sense. He was something worse. Something unstoppable. Alice slid beside him, her breathing ragged. What the hell do we do? Carter looked down at his rifle, then at the glowing veins in the ground. The whole place pulsed like a living thing. The fortress wasn't just his domain. It was part of him. We can't kill him, Carter said, gripping his last remaining explosives. But we can kill this place. Alice's eyes flicked toward the pulsating veins beneath them. She understood immediately. That's suicide, she said. Carter managed a grim smile. We're already dead. Alice exhaled sharply. You got a plan? Blow the core. Take him with us. A long silence. Then she nodded. All right. They moved fast. The butcher was still tearing through the others, his form shifting, flickering between the battlefield and something else entirely, another plane of existence. His body seemed wrong, like he wasn't fully here. Which meant he had a weakness. Carter and Alice planted the charges along the glowing veins, securing them deep into the organic metal structure. The moment they did, the fortress reacted. The walls pulsed violently, the butcher's form flickering as if suddenly disrupted. He turned. You think you understand? He said, stepping toward them. You don't. Carter clicked the detonator. Maybe not, he said. But let's see what happens. The explosion was instant. The chamber erupted in white-hot fire, the glowing veins rupturing as the entire structure collapsed inward. The butcher's form screamed, the shadows convulsing, writhing, breaking. The last thing Carter saw before the light consumed him was the butcher's face, shocked, almost amused. And then darkness. Carter awoke to silence. Not the comforting kind, the kind that felt wrong. The kind that came after an explosion should have left nothing behind. His body ached, his skin burned, but he was alive. He forced his eyes open and saw nothing. The fortress was gone. The battlefield, the hunters, even the sky itself, gone. He floated in a void, weightless, surrounded by an endless stretch of black that pulsed faintly, like something breathing. Then he heard the voice. You think you won? Carter turned, or rather, he thought he turned. He had no body here, no real form. And yet, the butcher stood before him, as solid and real as he had been before the explosion. His armor was cracked, his form flickering, but his eyes burned just as fiercely as ever. You should be dead, Carter rasped. The butcher chuckled, a deep, unsettling sound. I am. He stepped closer, his presence distorting the space around him. And so are you. Carter clenched his fists, or tried to. He still wasn't sure he had hands anymore. Then why are we talking? The butcher tilted his head, amused. Because you still don't understand. The void around them shifted, and suddenly Carter saw it, everything. The past. The truth. The universal authority had never sent them to kill the butcher. They had sent them to feed him. World after world, cycle after cycle, the authority had funneled warriors, assassins, and soldiers into the butcher's grasp, not to destroy him, but to sustain him. Each death, each soul consumed, had made him stronger. He wasn't a man. He wasn't even a monster. He was a system. A machine designed to purge the weak and leave only the strongest standing. And when the strongest fell, they fed him. Carter saw it all, playing out in endless loops. How many times had they sent hunters like him? How many times had the story been rewritten, the truth buried beneath medals and memorials? His stomach twisted. They knew. The butcher nodded. Of course they did. They always do. The void pulsed again, and Carter felt himself slipping, his body, his soul, whatever was left of him, fading. He gritted his teeth, fighting against it, refusing to be just another name in the cycle. The butcher watched, curious. You fight. Even now. Yeah, Carter growled. Because screw you. And then he fell. Pain slammed into him, breath rushing back into his lungs like he'd been drowning and just now broken the surface. The cold bite of solid ground pressed against his back, and when he opened his eyes he saw stars. He was alive. Somehow. Alice's voice crackled over his comms, weak but there. Carter? He groaned, rolling onto his side. Still breathing. You. She stopped, clearly not believing it herself. You made it? Looks like it. The ruins of the fortress lay in pieces around them, molten debris still cooling. The others were gone. The butcher was gone. It was over. Or so he thought. A faint hum vibrated beneath his fingers, deep beneath the surface, barely perceptible. A heartbeat. He wasn't dead. Not really. Carter pressed his palm to the ground, eyes narrowing. Alice's voice came again. Tell me that's not what I think it is. But Carter already knew. They hadn't killed him. They had only reset the cycle. He looked to the sky, where a universal authority ship was already descending, likely here to collect the fallen. Likely already preparing the next lie. Alice sat beside him, silent for a long time before muttering. They'll send more, won't they? Carter exhaled. Yeah. And when he wakes up, it starts again. Either of them spoke for a while. Then Carter pulled his last remaining pistol from his holster, checked the magazine, and sighed. Then let's make sure we're ready. Asterisk. The official story spread across the galaxy within days. The Butcher of Worlds was dead. The universal authority declared it a triumph, praising the bravery and sacrifice of the 100 elite hunters who gave their lives to end the nightmare. Memorials were erected, their names etched in stone on planets they would never see. Songs were written, embellishing the legend, how the bravest warriors in the universe had slain the unkillable. Only 2 names were missing from the list, Carter and Alice. Because as far as the authority was concerned, they didn't exist anymore. From the shadows, they watched as the story unfolded, just as it had before. There was no hesitation, no time wasted. The authority used the butcher's supposed death as justification to push further, to conquer more, to claim that they were the true force of order in a lawless universe. But Carter knew the truth. They were already searching for the next butcher. And if they couldn't find one, they'd make one. In the deep reaches of uncharted space, a salvage crew picked through the wreckage of the fortress. They were bottom feeders, scavengers who arrived after the war to pick through the bones of history. But even they knew something was wrong here. The structures were wrong, not just broken, but shifting, even in ruin. One of them nudged a piece of blackened armor with his boot. It felt warm. One of the younger scavengers frowned. Shouldn't this be, dead? The crew chief, An older man with more scars than sense spit onto the ground. If it was alive in the first place. They found bodies, or what was left of them. The ground had swallowed some whole, others were little more than dust. But there was something else, something deeper beneath the wreckage. A pulse. The ground vibrated, ever so slightly. None of them had ever felt a planet breathe before. The youngest scavenger took a step back. "Boss?" The crew chief didn't answer. He was staring at something, someone. A figure, half buried in the wreckage. Armor cracked but still intact. A hand twitched. The butcher opened his eyes. The authority wasted no time assembling a new team. Files were marked classified. Names were pulled from across the galaxy: mercenaries, assassins, war criminals with nowhere else to go. One of the officials stood before the gathered soldiers, reading from the same script they had always used. "The Butcher of Worlds has returned." They never questioned it. Never asked how or why. It wasn't their job to ask. It was their job to obey. And so, the cycle began again. In a nameless bar on a backwater moon, Carter and Alice watched the announcement on a flickering screen. The authority had already sent out the call. Another 100 hunters. Another suicide mission. Carter drained his drink and exhaled slowly. "So," he muttered, "how do you feel about breaking 100 idiots out of the worst mistake of their lives?" Alice smirked. "Sounds fun." They stood, weapons in hand, and walked toward the door. Because this time, they weren't playing by the RU.